Hello, everyone. My name is Arendtsz. I'm the founder and CEO of Celigo. With me today, I have Matt Graney, VP of Product at Celigo as well. And we're here today to talk about automation to grow and scale your business, especially scaling software companies. So SaaS, the SaaS model has been around for about 20 years. SaaS started way back in 2000. The first known SaaS company was Concur. And then, of course, there was Salesforce in around 2000. For those of you who are old enough to remember that era, Salesforce had this slogan called end of software or no software, which used to be in red. That's how we got started. That was the battle that they were trying to fight at that time. And if you were to fast forward to today, 20 years later, there are thousands of SaaS applications, well over 10,000 on last count. And we've come a long, long ways in the last 20 years. A couple of things that have happened along the way is that more and more SaaS applications, vendors have come in and gone deep in specific functionality. They've taken a sliver out of another larger SaaS app and they've gone deep. So that continues to happen. And then a number of these SaaS apps, especially the ones created fairly recently in the last 5-10 years, they have been consumerized as well, so that these SaaS apps today don't look like anything from the past. They look like the personal apps that we use on our devices in our personal lives today. So these SaaS applications have been consumerized as well. And as we speak, there are lots and lots of other SaaS companies just like you who are building the next generation, the next evolution of SaaS. So the bottom line is there is a SaaS application for pretty much every business function that you can think about today. It's increasingly easy to acquire and start using these SaaS applications, often at a departmental level. And then companies of all sizes, all types of industries have fully embraced SaaS. That's not a question anymore. That's just a fact. And especially software companies have been at the forefront in the adoption of SaaS applications in their enterprise. So we can see that manifest itself in the number of SaaS apps in a typical enterprise. So if you were to look at this, the three boxes there on the top, a typical SMB company, defined as a company with less than 100 employees, is using about 100 SaaS applications. On the other end of the spectrum, an enterprise company, above 1,000 employees, based on this definition, is using close to 300 SaaS applications. And mid-market companies who sit in the middle are using close to 200 applications. Not only that, the spend on SaaS applications is growing aggressively. Last year, across the board, across all these three segments, companies spent 50% more than the prior year on SaaS. If you were to focus on the mid-market sector, looking at the chart there on the bottom, and by the way, this data is coming from Blissfully as part of their SaaS Trends Report in 2020. If you look at the mid-market spend, on average, it's over 2 million, close to 2.5 million. Celigo is also a mid-market company. We have 200 employees, and certainly I know how much we spend on SaaS, and I think these numbers are spot on. I can't tell you for sure how many apps that we use because that's changing pretty much on a weekly basis as well. But these numbers match really well with what we are doing internally, as well as what we're seeing out there in the market. And so let's get into some details on what this might look in a typical enterprise. So think of this as a company, a fictitious company, let's say in a growth stage, who has a number of SaaS apps in the mix. And as they grow and scale the business, their needs start to change. They become more sophisticated. Maybe they need a specific billing application, or they may need professional services automation to deliver the software. They may need sales compensation, or on the IT side, they may need to spin up a data warehouse and put a BI front end on that, or perhaps invest in a single sign-on solution. And then as the sales process becomes more and more complex, they may need a CPQ in time. And as you can see, and per the last slide, even the smallest company can have up to about 100 SaaS applications, and this is only catching some of the highlights here. And while this is ultimately the best of breed model that we all live day to day, it also has some consequences in that there is a sprawl of apps, which we call the SaaS sprawl. not only is there a sprawl, but in time, that sprawl turns into silos as well. So working from the left to the right, if you look at the front office, typically sales and marketing, there are a number of apps that are clustered together. In the back office, the same thing, typically around an ERP, in finance and accounting, in HR, so on and so forth. And not all of these apps were kind of born equal, so to speak. There is a hierarchy within these applications. And if you look at the bigger boxes in blue, the CRM, the ERP, the HCM, these are what we call a foundational SaaS app. So what's a foundational SaaS app? A foundational SaaS app is an application that has a broad sense of responsibilities and footprint within the enterprise. And they own the system of record for key business objects in the enterprise. So let's go through some examples. What are some of the key business objects? It might be a lead, an account, an opportunity, a sales order, an employee, a vendor, a purchase order. And these foundational SaaS apps own those systems of record. And so what happens then is some of the most specialized SaaS applications that go deep ultimately need to access the foundational SaaS app or the system of record. So let's take one quick example. If you're building a time and expense type business application, ultimately you're going to have access to the employee business object. But the employee, the system of record or the master is not going to be the time and expense application. It's going to be in an HR app. So by definition, that time and expense application needs to connect with this HR app. And I'm sure a lot of you here in this session are going through this exact problem where in order for you to ultimately go to market and sell your product, there's a need for you to go ahead and build some of these integrations yourself. This is what we call vendor-built integrations, and Matt Graney is going to talk about this later on. So the takeaway here is there's a sprawl, there's a natural order, there's a hierarchy, there are foundational SaaS apps, and then ultimately there are silos. So we talked about SaaS applications. Now let's talk about business processes. Think about business processes as these processes that live on top of the sprawl of SaaS apps. I like to think of it as the operating system of the enterprise, the OS, because it's like a central nervous system. Everything that's important in the enterprise is going to go through a set of business processes. And as companies add more and more apps, what happens is a typical business process that was going to, back in the day, may have been encapsulated within one SaaS application or a couple, now get fragmented across multiple business applications. And so this, of course, is fragmentation. And to solve fragmentation, you need to automate some of those business processes so that you can make it all look like it's one common entity. So let's look at an example of a business process. And through that example, we want to see how fragmentation may occur. So what you see here on the screen is a typical quote-to-cash business process that a lot of you are familiar with. If you look at some of those boxes going from the left to the right, a salesperson may have an opportunity and they want to go ahead and put together a quote. And at some point, they have to go send that as a proposal. The deal desk team might get involved there. Then that sales order needs to be booked. Typically happens with sales ops and perhaps with the sales rep working with sales ops. The order needs to be approved. At some point, you need to provision end user licenses. You need to invoice that order. And then ultimately, of course, you need to be able to collect payment. This, as you can see, is touching multiple different departments and people for this business process to really work flawlessly. And the key thing is that it encapsulates a number of business applications. Typically, you might start with a CRM and an ERP or accounting app just to be able to book that order. But as a company grows, their needs change and business processes get more sophisticated. So let's take an example of a company. Let's say you are taking about 100 orders a month and business is doing well, and now you're starting to increase that volume and you want to go, all of a sudden, before you know it, 100 goes to a 500 and 1,000. And if you don't have this under control, you'll end up being a victim of your own success. Because what we want to see, and we've seen this many times in working with customers, is that the order processing time, if you don't have this fully figured out, tends to go up when it should be really coming down as you scale. And so not only that, now in this business process, you might decide to go ahead and add a CPQ solution, which means that the automation, how it needs to work, is going to change. So companies are going to make this process more and more sophisticated as they grow and scale. And that means there's going to be more fragmentation in the end. So what is the cost of this fragmentation? To put it in very simple terms, if you have this type of fragmentation, a business cannot scale and grow. And at some point, it's going to come back to bite you hard and surprise you. So imagine, let's go back to the quote to cash business process. If that was not automated and it spans multiple systems, just think about the complexity that's going to arise. A system further downstream may not have visibility into what's happening further upstream. So the visibility is going to be lacking. Maybe you're going to do manual data entry into another system, which is ultimately going to result in the data being incomplete or there being errors there. So integrity becomes a problem. And then eventually you're going to throw resources at this, which of course is not the most efficient way to do things. And then ultimately you as a company are not going to be agile. You are doing well, you're selling your product, but on back end, you can't keep pace with that success. So we talked about one business process, quote to cash. Of course, a typical company, and in this case, a software company, has multiple business processes. We've shown you a few here. This is representative, but certainly is not an all-inclusive list. And so I'll highlight a few of the business processes. The one there on the top left is suspect to prospect. That means that companies, especially when they get started, need to generate demand, generate leads, MQLs. They need to bring that into the CRM. So there needs to be a business process and automation there. Typically, that's done mostly with the so-called vendor-built integrations. Once you acquire a certain critical mass of customers, your customers may have issues, support tickets that they file. You need to be able to resolve that. That's where the issue to resolution business process comes into effect. As we talked about in the quote to cash, you might decide to have more of a dedicated billing application, especially subscription billing. And that, of course, has an impact on the quote to cash business process, and it turns into its own business process. When you're hiring employees, you need to be able to onboard them, and you need to provision them on various different SaaS applications. And when you deboard an employee, you need to be able to take access. And by the way, that's a great example of a business process where if you're only hiring an employee or terminating an employee once a month or once every 3 months, it's fine to do that manually, but at some point, once you start to do this at scale, then you need to think about automating that particular process so that it's efficient. And then the last example is you might decide to start up a data warehouse and do some advanced analytics, and you have to have processes to be able to seed that data repository with data from various other SaaS applications as well. As you can see there on the bottom row, of course, these business processes change by the stage of the company. Sometimes companies can be pretty mature at an early stage and get into some of these details, while some other companies might wait until it becomes more of a crisis. So in saying all of that, there is a need, ultimately, for a connected enterprise. So what's a connected enterprise? Recognizing that there are business processes that span multiple SaaS applications. We ultimately need to automate those business processes. And to automate a business process that spans multiple SaaS applications, you need to be able to integrate those various systems together. So what are some of the options for a connected enterprise? Let's start with what we call API-based coding. So every SaaS application has an API, and because they have an API, they should be able to, anyone should be able to come in and build integrations, and especially if they're using certain SaaS platforms to be able to do this. So let's think of a Salesforce or a NetSuite. There's the ability to be able to to use that platform and do coding to handle situations where they can go build specific custom integrations. The problem with these custom integrations is they are brittle, they're hard to maintain, and they don't scale. And in fact, ultimately, the customer ends up reinventing the wheel most of the time. The next option is to have point-to-point integrations, or in certain cases, consultingware. So these solutions tend to focus on a fairly narrow problem where there's a purpose-built solution, and it's often a black box. And a given company or a system integrator has built a solution. It might work great under certain circumstances, but in the end, long-term, there are deficiencies. It's hard to customize that. What you see is what you get. You can't really do anything beyond that unless you bring in other consultants to come in and be able to change some of this as well. And then the next category is vendor-built, SaaS vendor-built integrations, which is the most popular option. We talked about that a little bit early on. It serves some of the basic requirements. Again, similar to some of the other options, doesn't necessarily scale. One thing that we see often is when customers want to customize these SaaS vendor-built integrations, there are limited options there, and it's hard to also manage this. Just think about it for a second. If you have 100 SaaS applications in the enterprise, and each of those have multiple vendor-built integrations, you have a ton of integrations where one doesn't know about the existence of the other. So in time, there's going to be overlap, and there's going to be some thrashing around there as well. And the last option is, of course, going with an integration platform. So what's an integration platform? Or iPaaS for short, integration platform as a service. It standardizes the way that integrations can be built and managed. Without getting into a lot of the details down there, I just want to focus on two things. When we talk about integration, we always talk about building a particular integration, building those use cases. How easy is it to come in and be able to build those integrations? And the next part is to be able to then work to manage those integrations. Once it's built and put in production, what's the effort to manage things on an ongoing basis? So things like being able to monitor the integration, manage errors and recover and resolve those, to provide a centralized one pane of glass to see how all the integrations in the enterprise are running in a holistic fashion. These are some of the key features that an iPaaS brings to the table. So every company looks at integration in a different way, as you can expect. And the way they look at it is based on the maturity of the company when it comes to their SaaS applications, their business processes, and whether they want to automate the business processes. So this is where we introduce the concept of an integration maturity model. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Matt Graney to get into some of the other details around integration.
Thanks, Jan. And we'll begin with some of the pitfalls, and I'm going to echo many of the comments that Jan has already had for you. The first is about the lure of do-it-yourself integrations on the next slide. So it's tempting to say, well, okay, system A and system B, maybe system C, they all have APIs. We could just build it ourselves, build an integration ourselves to automate these key pieces of the business. Well, I would just caution you that it's often more complicated than you think. Yes, they have APIs, but are the APIs, are the systems always going to be available? What happens if a system changes its API, its governance rules? There are many reasons why issues that could be introduced. What are you going to do about reporting? What if a certain record, for example, didn't make it through the system? How are you going to go back and deal with that? And ultimately, it's not your core competency. It's not what you really want to be spending your engineering resources on. There's a high opportunity cost on those resources, and you'd be better off investing in things that are actually going to differentiate. And then the final thing, of course, is even if you can do it for version 1.0, what happens in the future? Your business needs are going to evolve, just as I described, with multiple apps, especially when you see such fine-grained applications. Things that used to be features are now entire companies. And once they're in place, again, APIs change, right? It's not going to be static. So just be aware that you may well have an engineering team that could indeed build it, but is that really where you want to be spending your time and money? The final one I'll mention is just about the need to organize and prioritize. Don't assume you can do it all at once. Just as we've talked about the evolution of companies, whether it's in terms of the number of apps, the business processes that are most critical as a company evolves. Think about this as you build a kind of integration roadmap. Think about the impact that the lack of automation is having on the business. Think about the cost on the business as well as the cost to solve the integration problem, and then the complexity. And use those factors as a way of prioritizing where you choose to spend your time. So I'll just transition now to talk about some common integration patterns, because I think you'll recognize in here the sorts of things you'll run into throughout your own organization. The first kind is just about getting data to where it needs to be so it's ready. So think of that in terms of synchronizing contact details between, say, the CRM and the marketing automation system, or the CRM and the ERP for billing purposes. It's not necessarily at the moment of synchronization part of a business process, but you need the information there in order that when the business process runs, it's going to run correctly. Maybe it's related to the assignment of account reps to various territories. Maybe it's related to updating of SKUs in an e-commerce system. So synchronizing that data is really key, just to make sure it's available where it's needed. And another common pattern actually around synchronization is even in cases where you just don't have all the licenses for enough systems. So maybe you have sales reps, of course, who have accounts in the CRM, but there are many people in the company who want to know when a sales order is closed won, or many stakeholders that want to know when a VIP customer logs a support ticket. So synchronization can actually be good for that as well, perhaps to take something out of a system of record and get it into a collaboration tool just for visibility. So this relates to the middle one here around liberating data. And that's about getting data into systems of record for reporting. So whether that's like a data warehouse or data lake kinds of use cases, but also for synchronizing campaign results, so from a marketing automation system back into the CRM. So it's about providing 360-degree visibility so that you can build reports and so on there. And the final one here is really to bring it home. It's where we began, and that's talking about business processes. The fact is that your business processes are spanning multiple applications. Typically, there's going to be one or two systems of record in there, maybe different systems of records for different parts of the organization. For sales, it's the CRM. For finance, it's the accounting or ERP system. For support, it's a case management system. And when business processes cross multiple apps in this way, as we've described, automation and integration enables those to flow properly. So this is really the main one that we've talked about today, and the one I wanted to finish with. So to wrap it all up, you need to think about your automation strategy and the way integration plays into that. And there are 5 key things we would leave you with. The first, if we build, is to get an idea of the application landscape. It's changing all the time, as Jan said. It's changing almost on a weekly basis, even in a mid-sized company like ours. Next, you want to understand the cost of fragmentation. Where are the breakdowns occurring? What is it costing you from, whether it's about time to close, whether it's about duplication of efforts, whether it's about lack of visibility. The next is to have an integration roadmap. Think about the most important pieces of that puzzle, where the gaps and the friction is greatest, and put a plan together to address those in some sort of priority order. Then you should leverage out-of-the-box integrations where you can, but be aware that they can only take you so far. So the vendor-built integrations are not to be ignored. But finally, keep in mind the advantages of using an integration platform, again, an iPaaS, in order to provide a common way of approaching integration, common visibility and reporting, and ultimately building a competency in an organization as you mature so that you can address fragmentation in your business processes.
Thank you, Matt. And I'll add one more thing. As Matt said, ultimately, everyone's circumstances are going to be different. There's not one cookie cutter type strategy. We've given you some details on how you can think about this, but ultimately you have to craft and adapt to a strategy that makes sense for you. But of course, knowing that there are certain well-honed best practices out there, such as the integration maturity model and some of the items discussed here. And folks, that's it for today. I hope that this is helpful for companies like you to be able to scale and automate your business. if you have any questions or if you want to talk to us about your integration or automation strategy, or would like to understand where you fit in the maturity model, please contact us at Celigo.com. Thank you so much.